on divine command theory. Now, I'm obviously not saying that Dr. Craig or all religious people are psychopaths and psychotics, but this, to me, is the true horror of religion. Okay, it allows perfectly decent and sane people to believe by the billions what only lunatics could believe on their own. Okay, if you wake up tomorrow morning thinking that saying a few Latin words over your pancakes is going to turn them into the body of Elvis Presley, okay, you have lost your mind. Okay? But if you think more or less the same thing about a cracker and the body of Jesus, you're just a Catholic. And I'm not the first person to notice that it's a very strange sort of loving God who would make salvation depend on believing in him on bad evidence. Okay, I mean, if you lived 2,000 years ago, there was evidence galore. I mean, he was just performing miracles, but apparently he got tired of being so helpful. Okay, and so now we all inherit this very heavy burden of the doctrine's implausibility. And the effort to square it with what we now know about the cosmos and what we know about the all-too-human origins of Scripture becomes more and more difficult. Okay, and it's not just the generic God that Dr. Craig is recommending. It is God the Father and Jesus the Son. Okay, Christianity, on Dr. Craig's account, is the true moral wealth of the world. Well, I hate to break it to you here at Notre Dame, but Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice. Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. It is a religion that celebrates a single human sacrifice as though it were effective. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. John 3:16. Okay, the idea is that Jesus suffered the crucifixion so that none need suffer hell, except those billions in India and billions like them throughout history. Okay, this is astride. This doctrine is astride a contemptible history of scientific ignorance and religious barbarism. We come from people who used to bury children under the foundations of new buildings as offerings to their imaginary gods. I mean, just think about that. In vast numbers of societies, people would bury children in post holes, people like ourselves thinking that this would prevent an invisible being from knocking down their buildings. Okay. These are the sorts of people who wrote the Bible. Okay. If there is a less moral framework than the one Dr. Craig is proposing, I haven't heard of it.
Professor Craig now has 8 minutes for a rebuttal. Timekeeper, are you ready? Begin.
The less moral framework is atheism. Atheism has no grounds for objective moral values or duties. And it's interesting that in that last speech, I was disappointed to hear no defense given of that crucial second contention that I offered against Dr. Harris's view. Remember, we talked about the value problem. I gave what I consider a knockdown argument to show that the moral landscape is not identical to the continuum of human flourishing. We talked about objective moral duties, the is versus ought distinction, the ought implies can problem. None of these have been responded to. So if you want a really desperate moral system, try atheism. There's no foundation for objective moral values and duties there. Now, what about theism? Does it do any better? Well, in the last speech, we heard some attacks on my first contention that God provides a sound foundation for morality. Unfortunately, it seems to be that most of these were red herrings. A red herring is a smelly old fish that's dragged across the path of the bloodhounds to distract them from their true quarry so they get distracted and go off following the dead fish. And I'm not going to be distracted by the red herrings that were offered in that last speech. For example, in response to my claim that if God exists, then objective moral values exist, we heard that I haven't truly offered an alternative to his view because the goal on theism is to avoid hell. Honestly, it just simply shows how poorly Sam Harris understands Christianity. You don't believe in God to avoid going to hell. Belief in God isn't some kind of fire insurance. You believe in God because God, as the supreme good, is the appropriate object of adoration and love. He is goodness itself to be desired for its own sake. And so the fulfillment of human existence is to be found in relation to God. It is because of who God is and his moral worth that he is worthy of worship. It has nothing to do with avoiding hell or promoting your own well-being. He then responds, but there's no good reason to believe that such a being exists. Look at the problem of evil and the problem of the unevangelized. Both of these, as I explained in my opening speech, are irrelevant in tonight's debate because I'm not arguing that God exists. Maybe he's right. Maybe these are insuperable objections to Christianity or to theism. It wouldn't affect either of my contentions that if God exists, then we have a sound foundation for moral values and duties. If then we have no foundation for objective moral values and duties. So these are red herrings. Now, I have written on each of these problems, the problem of evil and the problem of the unevangelized, and you can find much of what I've said at our website, reasonablefaith.org. If you're interested, go ahead and look at that. Or, as Michael Ray suggested, talk to one of your philosophy professors. Michael has written extensively on the problem of evil, and I'm sure he'd love to have a conversation with you about those things. Notice, secondly, I would want to say, evil actually proves that God exists. Because if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. If evil exists, then it follows that values and duties do exist, namely some things are evil. So evil actually proves the existence of God, since in the absence of God, good and evil as such would not exist. So you cannot press both the problem of evil and agree with my contention that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, because evil actually will be an argument for the existence of God. Notice that Dr. Harris has no moral foundation for saying that Christian beliefs are morally execrable, because he has no foundation for making such a judgment. If atheism is true, what objective foundation is there for affirming that one view is execrable and another is not? There's simply no basis for such judgments. So, if he wants to have a debate on theism, I will happily engage in one with him, but that's not the debate for tonight. He also says it's psychopathic to believe these things. Now, that remark is just as stupid as it is insulting. It is absurd to think that people like Professor Peter Van Inwagen here at the University of Notre Dame is psychopathic, or that a guy like Dr. Tom Flint, who is as gracious a Christian gentleman as I could have ever met, is psychopathic. This is simply below the belt. So it seems to me that we've not been given any refutation of the view that if God does exist, then his essence, his character, is determinative for the existence of objective moral values. What about objective moral duties? Here I explained that God's commands must be consistent with his nature. And Dr. Harris continues to press the point, but the Bible supports slavery. Again, I'll refer you to Professor Copan's book, which shows that is a gross misrepresentation of ancient Israel, which did not, in fact, promote slavery as we understand it in light of the experience in the American South. But again, that's simply not irrelevant because that isn't relevant because I'm not defending the Bible tonight. I'm saying that for a theist, whether Jew, Christian, deist, Hindu, moral duties will be grounded in the divine commands which are based in his nature. He says, but then what about people like the Taliban who say that God has commanded them to do certain atrocities? I would say the very same thing to the Taliban that Dr. Harris says, namely, God did not command you to do those things. That's exactly what Dr. Harris would say. The reason he thinks that is because he doesn't believe that God exists, but I would say that because I think that the Taliban has got the wrong God, that in fact God hasn't commanded them to commit these atrocities, and indeed God will only issue such commands as are consistent with his moral nature and for which he has morally sufficient reasons. So I don't think this first contention is really in much dispute tonight. I think it's obvious that if God exists, then obviously objective moral values exist independently of human opinion. They're grounded in the character of God. And there would be objective moral duties if God exists, because our duties arise in response to the moral imperatives that God issues to us. So the real debate is on that second contention. Can atheism provide a good foundation for objective moral values and duties? And I think we've seen powerful reasons to think that it cannot.
Dr. Harris now has 8 minutes. Timekeeper, are you ready? Begin.
Well, perhaps you've noticed Dr. Craig has a charming habit of summarizing his opponent's points in a way in which they were not actually given, so I will leave it to you to sort it out on YouTube. Needless to say, I didn't call those esteemed colleagues of his psychopaths, as I made clear. In any case, Dr. Craig has merely defined God as being intrinsically good. If you want to charge someone with merely semantic games, the shoe's on the other foot as well. There is no reason that I can see why there couldn't be an evil God, or several. Okay, but his God is intrinsically good. Goodness is grounded in his very nature. That is a definitional move that he's made. Now, I have presented a positive case for grounding an objective morality in the context of science. And thinking about moral truth in the context of science should only pose a problem for you if you imagine that a science of morality has to be absolutely self-justifying in a way that no science ever could be. Okay, every branch of science must rely on certain axiomatic assumptions, okay, certain core values. And a science of morality would be on the same footing as a science of medicine or physics or chemistry. You need only assume that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad and worth avoiding, and indeed the worst case scenario for conscious life. And if science is unscientific, if having a value assumption at the core renders science unscientific, what is scientific? Now, Dr. Craig is confused about what it means to speak with scientific objectivity about the human condition. He says things like, from the point of view of science, we're just constellations of atoms and we're no more valuable than rats or insects. Okay, as though the only scientifically objective thing that could be said about us is that we're constellations of atoms. Okay, there are two very different senses in which we use these terms, subjective and objective. Okay, the first is epistemological. It relates to how we know. And when we say we're reasoning or thinking objectively in this sense, we're talking about the style in which we're thinking. We're talking about the fact that we're seeing through our biases, which is to say, trying to jettison bias. We are reasoning in a way that's available to the data. Our minds are open to counter-arguments. Now, this is the absolute foundation of science, and this is what opens such an invidious gulf between science and religion, the difference here in this approach to objectivity. But science does not require that we ignore the fact that certain facts are subjective, ontologically subjective. Okay, there are facts about the human condition that science can understand and study that are first-person facts, facts about what it's like to be you. Okay, and we can study these facts, and our study of them reveals how much deeper and richer and more meaningful our lives are than the lives of cockroaches. Okay, so this is a false reductionism that he's purveying here.